Hello crafty friends, I'm Lien from Studio Kato and I'm so happy to be back with my second Betterpress video. I am very much enjoying the Betterpress system. I did a full review and I found a great hack in my previous video. I will link that down below. But today we're going to talk about watercoloring with the Betterpress plates or watercoloring the Betterpress panels. So to start out with, I am going to be using the Betterpress system as it was intended, except I am going to show you my little hack to get an even better impression on this Betterpress cardstock. Now with this hack, you can even get a great impression on colored cardstock and various different cardstocks that aren't necessarily meant for the Betterpress. But this is the Betterpress Porcelain cardstock. It's their white cotton cardstock. And I have taped a paper towel down first on my platen, which is the clear plate of the Betterpress. And on top of that, I am taping an A2 size panel of that Betterpress cotton cardstock down. What the paper towel is going to do, it's going to give you more cushion to press the plate and the ink into that cardstock. Now the plate I am using today is the pressed Bouquet plate, and it's such a gorgeous flower. I think this is my favorite Bouquet so far, because they've already come out with a couple of fun floral images, and I think this is my favorite. I just love that big bold flower in the center of it. I'm inking this up with the Betterpress black ink, and then I am going to run this through my die cutting machine. So this is the result. It is stunning every single time. I adore this. And the Betterpress cardstock is so luxurious. I love that cotton cardstock. It's just on the expensive side, so I'm going to save it for some special projects probably. The second plate I'll be using is the Butterfly Garden, and this also comes with some dies as well. So you have that background, you can leave the sentiment out of it, so you can just use the background on its own, or you can slot that sentiment into place, and there is a die for just the sentiment, so really just the words. There's a die to cut out the butterfly on its own, and then there's a die to cut out the butterfly with that sentiment and the little frame around it. The cardstock I'm using now is Canson XL Watercolor cardstock, and I have sprayed some water on the back of this to make it even more malleable for the Betterpress system. And again, I have used a paper towel on my platen to provide some extra cushion, because on this cardstock you actually need it. You're not going to get a good impression on this cardstock without that, without wetting the back of it, and without using that paper towel. I've inked this plate up with the Mulberry Betterpress ink, and it's so gorgeous. I think this is my favorite color so far. It's just a really stunning purplish red. I love it. And you get a decent impression. This is not an impression that's as good as we had before on that cotton cardstock, and that's why I'm making this video. Actually, I wanted to compare the two cardstocks for their watercolor, how they hold up with watercoloring. I'm also going to share some tips on how to watercolor these panels. And in the end, we're going to sort of make a comparison and weigh up the pros and cons of each of these cardstocks. So the first tip and the most important tip I can give you for coloring these panels is the watercolor you choose to use. I chose to use Ecoline liquid watercolors. That's by no means the only watercolor you can use with these panels. But what you do want to use especially is transparent watercolors. So I know that these Ecoline watercolors are extremely transparent. There is no white pigment involved whatsoever. If you want to check your watercolors, some are pretty clear that they have white mixed into their paints. You can just tell by looking at them. If you can't tell by looking at them, you can just look up the pigment information on your watercolors. If there is titanium white or any variation of that pigment in it, it's probably not going to be transparent. If you find pigment information on your watercolors, it probably has a transparency rating next to it. Some watercolors do that, so you can look that up as well. Or you can just experiment with your watercolors. Just draw a black line on some scrap watercolor cardstock, go over it with your colors, and if the line sort of fades or if the line isn't as clear anymore as before, your watercolors aren't as transparent. Now, why is this important for the Betterpress panels you make? Because the Betterpress presses your ink into the cardstock. You get a debossed look for your lines, which is lovely and great, and I adore it. But that also means that the paint will sink into those lines if you paint over them. And this ink doesn't resist the paint. So the paint will lie on top of it, and if it's not transparent, your line isn't going to disappear. No watercolor is that opaque unless you're using, no watercolor is that opaque, I think. But you have some watercolors that are more or less transparent than others. So just be aware of that. If you don't mind that your black outlines will look a little more dull after watercoloring them, then this tip doesn't really affect you, but I really like a crisp outline. So I am very aware that I want to use transparent watercolors with these inks or with these panels. If you want a lighter color with watercolor, just mix in more water instead of mixing in white. I always do this. I never use white watercolors. I just don't like how they make my paints look, because I love transparency anyway in watercolors, even when I'm not coloring Betterpress panels. So I highly recommend these Ecoline liquid watercolors. I think they're great. If you're in Europe, they're definitely available in your local art supply shop. Online, they sell them everywhere. I don't know how easily you can get them in the US, but I do know they're available there. You just might have to look a little further. I will try to find a link to a US store as well, because I do know that most of my subscribers are from the US. So I'll try to find a link to a US store or maybe Amazon in the US, and link it down below, because I do love these. You can buy the jars separately. There are sets available. My set I'm definitely not going to find online because it's insanely old. It's not available anymore. But you can definitely get some sets with fun colors as well. Now, this was watercolor cardstock, so I knew this would go great. Although I do want to say that coloring Betterpress panels, it's not really challenging, but it takes some adjusting. I am very much used to coloring with embossed outlines. So I usually emboss my outlines when I stamp them. So it's very hard to color outside the lines with an embossed outline. With a debossed outline, it's a lot easier, I've discovered. So it just took a little bit of adjusting to me. Also these plates are so detailed, and some of the more detailed areas, if you have a super fine stem, it's just a little bit harder to color. I don't know if that's just because I'm out of practice, because I haven't watercolored a ton in the last couple months, but yeah, it was a little bit harder to color these panels in general, just a little bit of adjusting. So you might want to make 2 panels and just practice on one before you actually start making your card. Now here you can see that gorgeous bouquet again, the pressed bouquet. I really adore that image. The details on this are incredible, and this is done on that porcelain Betterpress cardstock, and I do love the cardstock. There are some advantages to it because, one, you get a better impression with your plates on this cardstock, so the letterpress effect is going to be better on this cardstock. And this is very nice white cardstock. No watercolor cardstock, maybe the Tim Holtz one. I haven't tried that yet. I have plenty of watercolor cardstock anyway, so I'm not going to try it. But most watercolor cardstock isn't white. It's a very creamy color. And I don't mind that. I'm used to that color. But if you want a nice white card, this is going to be a better option than most watercolor cardstock. Again, I don't know about the Tim Holtz one. I do know that it's supposed to be very white. I don't have it, so I can't compare. So those are 2 points in favor of this Porcelain Betterpress cardstock. The one point it has against it is that it's definitely not made for watercoloring. It's a lot harder to get the color moving once it's starting to dry, because the pigment really sinks into this cardstock. And yeah, that's not something that watercolor cardstock usually does. So you want to work a little bit quicker on this cardstock, and maybe wetting an area first just with water before dropping your paints in will work a little bit better to help keep the color moving. What's also a little bit harder, because the pigment sinks in, is correcting any mistakes. Usually you can lift some watercolors. I know these Ecoline watercolors definitely lift very easily off of your regular watercolor cardstock, not so much off of this one. So if you color outside the lines, it's going to be harder to correct it on this cardstock. Now, this is a very detailed image, so I didn't experiment with this too much, but I could tell that this cardstock couldn't really hold up to as much water as I'm used to. So that's also something to be aware of. You want to let your layers definitely dry in between to build up your colors instead of just using a lot of paint all at once, because the cardstock will buckle. This is not made to hold a lot of water. Now I finished that card off just with a Glimmer sentiment and some gems, and for this one I really just put it on a top folding white note card, and that's it. I think the letterpress effect is so gorgeous on its own, you don't really need to add much to it. I hope you like these cards. I had a lot of fun painting these. I am having so much fun with the Betterpress system, and I hope you enjoyed this little review of the cardstock as well. If you want to know more about the Betterpress system, my thoughts on it, and how you can get a great impression on other cardstocks, you can check out the video linked below. Thank you so much for watching. Leave a comment if you have a question or if you have something to say, and definitely subscribe to see more of my future videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.